Okay, hello everyone and welcome to this MOLA webinar on the Brentford Waterside site. So I'm Grant Benson, I'm an archaeologist for MOLA, and just a little bit of housekeeping about GoToWebinar. So on the right of your screens, you're all currently in listen only mode. On the right of your screen, you will see a question box. So as we give this presentation and the live Q&A afterwards, put those questions in there and get them into the speaker so that we have stuff for them to talk about. That is how you will interact with the speaker. Okay, so we will have, first off, we will have Magnus Kops, who is the Head of Programming and Partnerships here at MOLA, giving you a presentation on the archaeology at Brentford, followed by a live Q&A with various panels that we'll introduce after the presentation, various panelists that we'll introduce after the presentation. So without further ado, I'll disappear for a bit and I will hand you over to Magnus.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for joining. Thanks, Grant, for that introduction too. Pardon me one moment while I share my screen. As Grant said, my name is Magnus and I'm Head of Partnerships and Programming at Museum of London Archaeology. Some of you may have encountered me back in autumn 2019 when we ran a consultation event around the research aims of the excavations that are currently live at Brentford Waterside at the Brentford project. Those thoughts and ideas that were gathered on that night have been integrated into the strategy that we've been using to excavate the site. Bear with me just one moment, we're having a slight technical hitch here. Grant, I don't have a screen share option. Many of you will know a great deal about the Archaeology of Brentford already, but this evening, for those that don't, I'll start with a bit of background and context. And then through some of the findings from the site. As part of that process, I'll have some video from my colleague, who's the senior archaeologist who's actually been working on the excavation. We'll follow the end of the presentation with a question and answer session. And at that point, I'll be joined by colleagues who've been managing the archaeological works, Mike Smith and David Divers, as well as Helen McQuarrie from Orion Heritage, who are the planning and archaeology consultants on the Brentford project. As many of you will know, the site comprises the land to the south of the High Street and just north of the River Brent. The area we consider in planning the archaeological works, however, is much larger, and we do this in order to put the site into context in its wider setting. You can see the red line of the site boundary, that long stretch along Brentford High Street, and then you can also see the southern edge here of the study area, the dashed line. So we're looking at the site in a quite wide context, covering both banks of the Thames here. The site is, of course, at the confluence of the Brent, one of the longest Thames tributaries, and the River Thames itself. That leads to a complex and rich archaeological environment where the rivers themselves are a major influence on land use. If we move on to this next slide, this is an extract from the Greater London Historic Environment Record map of the area, and you can see on it various investigated areas and find spots in green triangles, green squares, blue triangles, or red circles. So each of those constitutes an individual record from the Historic Environment Record, and if you want to read more about those individual sites and the detailed background story, we can direct you to the desk-based assessment that was produced in support of the planning application, and there's also more information on our story map that we will that we will circulate information, the details of after the event. It's important to note with this slide that the concentration of finds along the high street both reflects the fact that this is where people have been settled in the past and in the present, but also the discovery of this kind of archaeology is contingent on new development, and it's also a place where a lot of new development has been taking place. So we'll start with the earliest phase of Brentford's past. This image isn't actually of Brentford. This is a visualization of the landscape in the Thames Valley in the early Holocene period, about 10,000 years ago. And I include this here to show you that to make the point really that in prehistoric times, the Thames was a very different river, and the landscape that we know today was very different. So we see a much wider, slower Thames here with many islets in it. And the point I make here is that we can't necessarily, for prehistory certainly, expect to see settlement and activities in the same places we do in later periods. We do have find spots of animal remains and large hand axes from the Paleolithic or Old Stone Age around Brentford in West London. However, the actual evidence for inhabited sites starts with the Mesolithic period or Middle Stone Age between 10,000 and 4,000 BC, where worked flints have been found on drier ground nearer the high street. However, there is more evidence still for Neolithic activity from 4,000 to 2,000 BC, which is when farming and static settlements, so people staying in one place, begin to become commonplace. And we have evidence of two Neolithic settlements close to the site. The first at 184 to 187 Brentford High Street, where we found 180 struck flints, other stone tools, and over 100 pieces of pot. And then a second possible settlement at Kew Bridge, where large monumental enclosures were recorded, potentially in relation to long barrows. So there is a rich vein of prehistoric activity around the site. As we move forward in time into the Bronze Age, when significant technological change arrives in this country between 2000 and 600 BC, we also find significant finds in the area, and some indication that there may have been a manufacturing site nearby. Should any of you have managed to get to the Museum of London's exhibition about the Havering Hoard last year, that just demonstrates the richness that can be encountered on marginal riverside sites such as Brentford. Some finds from the area are illustrated here. So we have a tongue-shaped shape on the right-hand side, and that's the very tip of a sheath for a sword. There's a coin here of the Kaleva Atrobatum. Kaleva Atrobatum was a pre-Roman settlement, which was then built up by the Romans on the road west from Londinium. And in fact, the Roman road that runs through Brentford linked Londinium with Kaleva Atrobatum, which corresponds with the approximate site of modern-day Silchester in Hampshire. And we also have here on the left-hand side a phalaray, which is a military decoration with enamel inlay from either a horse or perhaps even a soldier's armour. So then, looking forward again, one of the big questions for the Iron Age in Brentford's history is whether there was a crossing here associated with Caesar's invasion in the 1st century BC. So you can see here images of the Julius Caesar monument at Brentford in an earlier position to where you find it today, closer to the riverside itself. And some illustrations from Montague Sharp's early 20th century excavation of oak piles that were fixed along the river edge, and at the time claimed as evidence of this link between Brentford and Julius Caesar's invasion. However, the jury really remains still out. We do have much more definite evidence for a Roman settlement along the road that leads from London to Silchester that I mentioned previously. Brentford is approximately 10 miles from the city, and the next Roman settlement a similar distance again. So it's an ideal spot for a staging post In addition, Brentford is accessible as today by both river and road, making it a sensible place for a transport interchange. The archaeological evidence draws a picture of a settlement constructed of timber frame buildings with clay walls and possibly tiled roofs. And in contrast with Londinium, for example, this appears to be a not especially prosperous settlement. There is evidence of land and water management, given the proximity of the rivers, and we'll come on to more evidence of that that's been found in the recent excavations later. And so we can see here an image of excavations of the Roman road from excavations in 1977 in the lower left-hand corner of this slide. The Roman road ran about 30 metres north of the present High Street alignment. And in addition to that, there is evidence for Roman activity with burnt timber buildings at Sion Reach. And additional information on Roman roadside settlement at Brentford has been published by MOLA in this book at the end of the last decade. And you can find more details of that publication on the website. So moving on again, looking at more recent development in Brentford, you can see maps here on the left-hand side from the 1640s, the top right-hand side from the 1750s, and the bottom right-hand side from the 1870s. And in the first two of those, the site is outlined in red, and in the final one in black. So hopefully you're getting quite familiar with that site outline. We're seeing here a densification of the settlement over time, and commonly properties on the site between the river and the High Street are really making use of that. So if you look at the 1640s map here, you can see that there are wharves adjacent to these many properties running down to the Brent there, and that remains the case through into the later maps, where you can see in the final one Brentford Dock and a lot of additional activity on the riverside. And this important riverside usage continues into the 20th century and up to the present day, really, with the use of what you can see here, for example, canal boat yards adjacent to the Brent on the site. Moving on then to the archaeological excavations, the site for development purposes has been carved up into a number of blocks, and you can see them here. Excavations to date have taken place in blocks B, C and K in the greyed out area on the left-hand side, and live excavations are currently underway in block A, which includes St Lawrence's Church, and block D. The remaining blocks will constitute a second phase of excavation in due course. So what I'll do now is I'll hand you over to our video of Paolo Clemente, our senior archaeologist on the site, talking a bit more about the way we've been approaching features on the site and the kinds of things that were discovered in blocks B, C and K. Bear with me just one moment whilst I load this video up. Pardon me a moment, folks. Right, here we go.
My name is Paolo Clemente. I'm a senior archaeologist of the Museum of London Archaeology, and these are the ongoing excavations in the Brentford project. One is these walls, because you can see the Victorian walls underneath the modern concrete beams, And then you go, not in here, but up there you can see all those gravels, which are probably redeposited natural to level the ground in order to construct the building. And but obviously underneath, we got all these post-medieval layers, which could be make up. Again, in order to level or to rise the area, because as I said before, it's too close to the river, too wet. So probably they needed to rise the level in order to construct the buildings in a dry environment. When we'll be in the Roman layers, we'll see that it was closer to the river, more likely to be flooded. And it's probably for that the Romans were just digging ditches from north to south in order to get rid of the water. You can see this dark line. So this is a ditch, the base of a ditch or gully, which we can see the terminus. So it has been started there, probably for water management or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if you dig more and maybe find a pipe. Yeah, so what we do are these slots to see how the tree feature is in section. Well, also because on surface, the only thing you see is just a dark line. So if you don't dig it, you don't know how is the feature. It could be just the side of something bigger. So in order to characterize the feature, you need to dig a slot through it. We record it, photograph, plan it, probably draw the section as well. And we put all the finds, they go to the office, they get processed, and then the specialist will assess or will give us a report with rating, function, everything. The site was behind me, where now you can see all these buildings in construction. And what we did initially was an evaluation in 2019, followed by a mitigation because we're from archaeology. We don't have archaeological features of the prehistoric period, but we got finds in the shape of dwarf flint, like blades, all scattered around the site. That means it was an activity in the terraces of the river Brent. We have to the west of the site a paleo channel that might be an old channel used by the river Brent to the south. This was silted afterwards, and then we got Roman features. Most of the Roman features might be related with a peripheral area of Londinium, the city of London. Most of them are ditches, pits, probably related with farming system, and water management. Obviously, we are on the slope, on a gentle slope from the high street to the river Brent, that they dug ditches in order to manage the water. We got also some sunken features that might be related with some industrial activity because we found snags. Apart from that, we found two graves. One of them, a stone-lined grave, just about below the former Brent Road that was in the site. So between all these Roman finds, there are some finds that we can highlight, like a brooch that was found in a ditch, Samian pottery, which was probably expensive pottery at that time, the wealthy people that was living in the area. We got coins as well, which I think are of the first century, so a very early Roman occupation of this area. No, we didn't find much medieval archaeology. We got probably a Venus log, some pits and post holes very close to the high street of Brentford. So it might be that because of this high street was following the Roman road, it was a good area to put the first buildings, to construct the first buildings of this Brentford area. Yeah, I think most of the medieval stuff, probably late medieval, is close to the high street today. nowadays High Street. Probably residual finds to the south of this slope. But I think probably the period was with more activity with the post-medieval, where we see probably rubbish pits with refuse of animal touching and stuff like that. Always quite close to the High Street. In the same period, probably we found like the old docks, like timber line to the north, that the actual dock nowadays. There we got also many beaches and pits and stuff like that. I think probably starting in the 18th century. So, but at that time, probably the Brent docks were quite active. They were constructing many factories in the area. So we got remains of the foundations and walls of these factories. So then in the 19th century, Victorian period, we got all this area with a row of streets from north to south. And we got the remains of all of these houses, the gardens, garden pits. I think then the modern buildings are well demolished before we started the evaluation. My name is Paulo Clement.
So good, we almost got him twice. I thought in this final section of the presentation we'd get a bit closer to some of those amazing finds that Paolo referred to in the video. These prehistoric flint flakes and tools that were highlighted, they were all found redeposited in later soils. So there isn't necessarily evidence of a surviving prehistoric settlement here, but there is evidence of activity. They do stand as evidence of activity in the area. And if not too distracted by the lovely sparkly nail polish of our archaeologist, you'll note the very fine lines just on the top edge of this piece of flint, especially on the left-hand side. Those are evidence of retouching in order to keep the flint blades sharp. Moving on into the Roman period, we're looking here at a phase plan of some of the Roman features and finds that Paolo mentioned in the video. Just to orient you, north is up, and the black line that cuts across the top left-hand corner of this slide is Brentford High Street. So you can see the two burials in the centre of the slide here that Paolo referenced, which were immediately adjacent to the line of Brent Way. I think Paolo referred to it as Brent Road, and then various other Roman features across the site. So if we move on then to specific Roman finds, this pair of large burnished blackware vessels were found. There's circa 50 or 60 centimetres across each, found in a pair. They're partially embedded into a contemporary floor surface. So they would have been sunk into this earth floor during their useful lives. The theory is potentially that this being a roadside stopover 10 miles from London, that there could be evidence, for example, of a bar, and similar pots are found embedded into serving counters in Pompeian Herculaneum, for example, with olives and other foods potentially stored in them, or they may have been used for an industrial process. One of the things to note here is because of that distance of the Roman road from the line of the modern High Street, so 30 metres north, we are quite far from that line of the Roman road here. So it might have been a little way for a hungry traveller to go, but nonetheless some really exciting finds on a real scale. And if we move on, more exciting still, I would say, is this amazing survival of a Roman sarcophagus burial. So the damage you can see here is compaction from later buildings constructed above it. And we're really excited to learn more about this in analysis. We don't currently have any clear dating, but as we move through the analytical process, we should be able to identify a fairly concise date for the individual. And the presence of a sarcophagus burial here may nuance that picture I referenced earlier of Brentford as a less prosperous Roman settlement. In our experience of Roman burials, it's only people of a certain prosperity that receive this kind of treatment. So there's an awful lot more to learn there, and we look forward to the opportunity to share that with you all in due course. This next slide here highlights really an absence rather than a presence, although as we often say in archaeology, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. Try saying that when you've had a gin and tonic. But what I'm talking about here is the absence of early medieval activity from the 5th to the 9th century, commonly known as the Anglo-Saxon period. And we found very limited evidence for that in our excavations so far, in spite of the fact that there are remains of Saxon activity to the north of the High Street. They just haven't presented themselves in our excavation areas. The images I put on the slide here are a visualization from one of our illustrators of London in the mid-18th, London Wick, as the Saxons called it, in the mid-18th century, so just west of the Roman city of London, around Fleet Street and the Strand. And this is really just to give an indication of how much activity there was in the river in this period. And in addition, on the top left-hand corner, you can see a slide of a fish trap at Isleworth, much closer to home, which has been recorded by the Thames Discovery Programme, one of our flagship community archaeology projects, only accessible at low tide, and that's of Anglo-Saxon date as well. So moving on then to the post-medieval evidence. So this for archaeologists, post-medieval is a big catch-all term covering everything from the sort of Tudors, so the middle of the 15th century up into the 19th century. Not a very useful term, so I'll talk about particular century dates from here on out. But what we can see here is a more developed view of those individual narrow plots of land with boundary walls and drainage culverts between them, running from the north, from the High Street, down toward the Brent, toward the line of the Brent. You'll see several cess and rubbish pits marked on there. This a cesspit is a pit used for human and animal night soil or waste. What's really fascinating is, as well as taking waste, these cesspits also take an awful lot of rubbish, which can give us huge amounts of evidence about day-to-day life and activities on site. So again, in the analysis phase, we'll learn a great deal from the contents of those pits. Evidence that we have found to date are objects like these clay tobacco pipes and decorated ceramics. So we can see smaller bowls on the pipes illustrated here, reflecting a comparatively high price of tobacco in the 17th century. As the scale of imports from the New World rise of tobacco through the 17th into the 18th and 19th century, we see the bowls of clay tobacco pipes like these expand in capacity. The ceramics, we know that ceramics like this were produced in the London area, although some were also imported. So there's every possibility that these were made nearby, but only full analysis will demonstrate the specifics of that. Moving on, we have these 18th, 19th century drains and cesspits that were marked on that phase plan. Again, as I say here, these are really substantial features, and the contents of them can speak volumes about families or living on the site or businesses operating in the area. Just to give a bit more of an overview here, this is looking out a view to the north from the bottom of the site during excavation, and you can see some slots similar to the ones Paolo was describing earlier in the middle ground on the left-hand side through that darker coloured ditch feature, and then a later 18th or 19th century brick-built feature in the foreground here. Finally, we do have evidence of 19th century roads and floors. I think the top left cobbled feature there is an earlier road surface from Brent Way, which was referred to in the video, and then the lower right-hand side image is of an interior floor surface within one of the 18th or 19th century buildings on the site. That brings us to the end of our presentation today. Thank you very much for watching and for joining us. We will take questions now. So as Grant mentioned, you can put them into the question interface on the right-hand side of your screen. And I will pick them out and either field them myself or refer them to my colleagues, Mike Smith and David Divers, or to Helen McQuarrie of Orion Heritage, who will all clock in now as our panelists for the question and answer session.
Okay, thank you for that, Magnus. That was fantastic. A reminder for everyone to get those questions in. If everyone and the panelists would like to turn on their webcams and their mics, we will go into the question and answer, and Magnus will be taking the lead on that. You'll see a little bit of me at the end as well, but for now, I'll hand you over to them for the questions and answers.
Right, I've got one question, two questions in thus far. One from Paul Belluet, who submitted this question in advance, who can't attend the webinar. And he has family members that were buried in St. Lawrence's graveyard. And he asks where and how the human remains are being currently stored before transfer and reburial at Brookwood, and their state as found. Paul is concerned that the level of vandalism in the churchyard may have had an impact on the preservation of human remains. So Helen, I wonder if you could field that one for us.
Yeah, well, I suppose there's two aspects to that question. There's the condition of the human remains, and so far as I understand it from the archaeological team on site, because there's quite a substantial overburden, the human remains are actually in quite good condition. The coffins in not so much good condition, but that's due to environmental conditions rather than vandalism. And basically the human remains will be stored temporarily on site and then taken as quickly as possible for reburial at Brookwood. Those that are going to be osteologically analysed will be taken back to MOLA's offices in London. But so far, the human remains that have been taken out will all be immediately reburied at Brookwood. Does that, have you got anything to add on the condition of the human remains, David? I don't know if there's anything you can add on that.
Great. Yeah, sorry, I was temporarily muted. No, the human remains are in very good condition, all things considered. Yeah, the vandalism that people may have seen on ground level hasn't extended into the ground. Yeah, no fears there.
Sorry, I just want to check. Magnus, can you see the questions?
Magnus may be muted.
I think, yeah.
Okay, so I'll ask a couple of the questions. So we have one from Sandy Kidd. Are the Roman burials anomalous or inside a Roman small town? Would anyone like to answer on that one?
Yeah, I'll take that. You often get burials in the Roman period along roadways. If anyone's been to Rome, they may have seen the Via Appia, which is absolutely lined with monumental tombs to the great and the good of the Roman Empire. So I don't think we're going to get anything like that in Brentford, but the presence of the sarcophagus might suggest that someone was looking to get themselves noticed in death as much as in life. So we've only got the two adult burials in Brentford. A child was found to the east of Catherine Wheel Road in the 1970s. So it looks like it's rather irregular spacing of burials interspersed amongst the settlement. I mean, there was a rule that you weren't supposed to bury in towns, but whether Brentford would have counted as a town, and whether out here in the sticks of Britannia they would have been so sticking to the rules, but it does look like it's odd burials along the line of the road.
Okay, brilliant. That's a good, strong answer. So we have a very broad question, to be honest, a very broad question. Was the archaeology better than you expected to find? And yeah, that is a very big picture question, but guessing again, which one of you is easiest to speak on that? Does anyone volunteer to take that?
I can give that one a go.
All right, let's go.
Yeah, no, the archaeology is pretty much, you know, like what we found in the evaluation trenches. Before we do any kind of archaeological excavations, we always do some smaller evaluation trenches to see what's there, so we can get the right resourcing to the site. And to be honest, we did quite a good job doing that, because what we found was pretty much as we expected. I think the great interest in what we're going to find in Brentford is the actual scale of the excavations. We get an opportunity to see a large landscape, you know, a long stretch along the high street and dropping down to the river. So there's kind of like several aspects to the communications in the area, the roads, the river, and the relationship between the two, and indeed the length of the site along that. So I think that's where the interest is going to lie, in the analysis of the results, rather than the actual specific finds of individual things on any particular plot, to be honest.
If I can just amplify that, I think it's also interesting to see how the land use changes over millennia. And the problems that people seem to have constantly had with water, with the Romans having to dig all their ditches to drain it, and then more or less abandoning the site as settlement after the Roman period, people moving up to the drier land, and then when people do move back in, they're having to build the ground up, as you saw in Paolo's film. I think one reason why we probably didn't see much sign of prehistoric settlement is that it wasn't actually settled. People were just using the land for its natural resources. They would go fowling or fishing or picking reeds for thatching and that sort of thing. So it was probably more valuable to them as a semi-natural landscape than as built on.
Okay, and then we have, that's a nice answer. And then we have another one aimed at Magnus, but I think between you all, you can probably answer this one. What will happen to all the open features, such as the drainage, the cesspits, etc., once the excavation is complete? Will they be covered up?
Shall I have a go?
Go for it, David.
Yeah, they won't so much be covered up. Most of the new buildings have got deep basements. So once we've finished removing all the archaeology, recording it, documenting it, recovering finds, then as part of the construction, they'll actually dig deeper. So all the soil which the archaeology was within will actually be reduced to a lower level. So yeah, there won't be any preservation on the site as such. It will be preserved by record and understanding.
Yeah, so that preservation by record is, of course, one of the principles of archaeology and commercial works. We do have incredible records of those features on sites. Okay, so on to the next questions. I think Magnus may be having internet trouble, so I apologize to those of you for that. So on to the next question. Do you have any clear evidence as to how the current site was used through the periods and how this evolved? So this is an ongoing thing, I imagine, for the reports. But Michael, if you'd like to just briefly mention what will happen.
Well, sorry if I understood the question rightly. I think we've touched already that you were getting a picture over 10 millennia of how the site's been used in various ways and how it's changed as people with different needs and technologies come along. It doesn't mean that the people before the Romans or after the Romans were less technologically able. They just had different technologies and different needs. So that's part of the excitement of archaeology, is seeing how human society evolves. And it's not necessarily a straight line from the so-called caveman up to the present day. People live differently. As if you travel around the world now, you'll see people live differently.
Okay, and there's a few people asking, so we have off the top, sorry, 1 second, I'm reading these. Some of these are very long, so I have a while to read them. Okay, we have one about, have there been any museum-worthy finds to date on this excavation? And then a few other questions that I'm going to combine together on this one. Will the people of Brentford be able to see these finds once they are conserved, presumably? If they exist, sorry. So anyone like to field that? Have you, to date, have you found anything that will be, you would class as museum worthy or worth, or will likely go on to display?
I think I could field that. I'm hoping my connection is.
Sorry about that. Sorry for jump off the line and allow you to get back to it.
Thanks very much for picking it up. You know, the written scheme of investigation for the investigation specifies that finds from the site must be deposited into the local repository, which is the Museum of London. We hope there should be some potential to display them more locally around that, and as an organisation, MOLA is committed to partnering with local institutions where possible to do that. Given the state of excavations, it's not possible to say what that programme might look like at this point.
Okay, do you want me to continue with the questions?
Yeah, would you mind?
It's okay, Magnus, it's all right. Okay, so I think we've covered a fair few of them. So many questions. It's lovely to see this many people in attendance and this many questions. I do apologize if we're not able to get around to all of them, but we have got a lot of questions. Oh, someone's interested to know if the osteological specimens are buried, then can we dig it up again for re-examination or for new study or something? So I think this is mainly a question aimed at the treatment of the bodies that have been exhumed. So I think that's for Helen.
So I'm not sure if I fully understand the question correctly, but in terms of how the human remains will be excavated, we've got there's a WSI that covers this programme of works, and essentially the whole thing will be done under archaeological conditions, and a sample of them will be osteologically analysed, and the purpose for this is to address research aims, to look at health and demographic movements, population, etc., etc. So essentially, yeah, a sample of the human remains that are being taken out from St Lawrence Church will be osteologically analysed, and then they will be reburied at Brookwood. It might be just by way of context in terms of, I appreciate that St Lawrence Church is going to have a lot of questions around it. We are currently doing an initial phase of excavation, which is just concentrated in the new burial ground and in the vicarage. Essentially, the boundary of the old burial ground shifted somewhat. So basically, we've got some human remains from the old burial ground in the vicarage, and then we've got the new burial ground, which runs from 1884 to, well, essentially 1970s. And so this first phase of work is only for the new burial ground and the vicarage. And yeah, essentially a sample of them will be taken for analysis, but then as soon as that analysis is done, they will be reburied And just, by way of context, we're going to be having a separate webinar, which is going to be dealing with all of the aspects of St Lawrence Church, and having specialists there to address some of the specific osteological questions, which I'm working with Ballymore and MOLA on the sort of broad framework of works, but we'll have specialists there that might be able to answer some specific technical questions on the osteology.
Okay, great. And then we have another question on, will the public be able to view the finds in the near future? And one about visiting the site, the same kind of question about access. So it says, will we be allowed, I presume this guy is local to the Brentford area, will they be allowed to visit the site to see the finds, kind of access at the moment? I presume this is still an open construction site, but I will let Helen field this one, or
Right.
David.
I mean, essentially at the moment, there's live excavation works in Block D and in the graveyard. Both areas are live construction sites, so it's not suitable to have people visiting the site currently. And obviously for security reasons, finds are taken off site back to MOLA's offices as sort of promptly as possible. So for health and safety reasons, it's just not possible to have people on site, unfortunately. On some sites that is possible, but just by the nature of the very large live construction site that we're working with here, it's not. We have been in discussions with Ballymore about doing a virtual tour, for example, of St Lawrence Church, which I think has got quite a lot of interest. So we're going to be working with MOLA to try and deliver that as soon as possible. And obviously we're going to be doing the community outreach programme to kind of get any sort of significant news about the finds or artefacts or archaeological, advances out to the public, so that people know what's going on.
Okay, well, I think you've already started to hit in on the next question, which is about what is the plan for future involvement with the community. So
I think I can field that if that's useful, Grant.
Yep.
So we have our existing story map that was created in 2019 to bring together background and findings from the site. We'll circulate the details of that, but we are updating it. We are planning a programme of blogs and social media posts. So to promote events like these, there's a second webinar that's been mentioned on the work at St Lawrence's Church on the 30th of September. And you can find more details about that at our website, mola.org.uk/events. And we'll also be publishing a blog post between now and the delivery of that webinar. We, before the schools broke up for the summer holidays, have been consulting with local teachers on a primary school digital resource pack on the archaeology of the site, and we'll be delivering that into local schools in the autumn term, along with a short animation aimed at explaining the archaeology of the site to Key Stage 2 students, which is really exciting, getting the knowledge we're generating out to all ages in the local area. We're currently in discussion about a potential virtual tour of St Lawrence's, and there may be additional video outputs on the finds on the site.
Okay, and there is, if I can find it, a very interesting question about the methods we use. So pre-dig, you assess the, nope, that's not the one. Sorry, we have a lot of questions. There is a question about, I'll start on that one and then I'll try and find this question again. Is there any chance of volunteers being used for the excavations at Brentford? I think this comes back to it being an open construction site, which makes volunteers very difficult to use in that situation.
As the person responsible for volunteering at MOLA, deploying volunteers to a site like Brentford isn't something we would consider for health and safety reasons.
Okay, we have a question. When do you think the riverfront started to be used for transport and wharfs? Roman, medieval, or more recent?
Earlier, I'd say.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that one, or just again?
Well, I think people have been using the river for transport ever since people turned up in Britain after the Ice Age. So, I mean, and we know increasingly that goods way back into the prehistoric period were transported long ways. Just think of the stones at Stonehenge as an extreme example, but it is clear that people were moving around with goods way back in prehistory. I mean, the Uzzi, the man who found in the glacier in the Italian Alps, came from what's now Switzerland, and he'd walked over the mountains into Italy to bring goods back to Switzerland, although they wouldn't have been called that then, and somehow got murdered on the way home.
Yeah, it's a fascinating. I've been over there myself and had a look years ago. Okay. We have a question about, wasn't the road much further north than the burials? I'm not sure who would be the best one to answer that one, but I think it's kind of the spatial relationship between the road and the burials.
Yeah, it does make it rather odd that you've got these roadside monuments that are so far away from the road, but it could be that it was on someone's land, and I think it's so far back in history and so undocumented that it's hard to answer that one.
Yeah, that's a mystery that can remain for a bit until more archaeological work is done to establish that one. Okay, sorry, there are so many questions coming in still, but we are coming to the end of our time. We only have around 9 minutes left. Have you found any Battle of Brentford artifacts or evidence? Sorry, it was a spelling mistake, and I wondered if it was a nautical thing for the battle. I was questioning whether it was being brought up. But yeah, Battle of Brentford artifacts or evidence.
There were two battles of Brentford. There's one in the 1000s between Edmund Ironside and King Canute, and then there's the one between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians in the Civil War in the 1640s. So I think the answer is, in both cases, nothing that we could actually nail down to it.
Okay, sorry, there are still many questions coming in. I'm just trying to read these as we go. Shorter questions, please, people. Short. I can't read that quick. I'm trying, but I'm not that.
Great to have so much interest, though. Thanks, everyone.
A lot of interest. Thank you a lot for all the ones there. What is this? Okay, there's a lot of questions about where the finds will end up, and we have a very specific one, which I'm not sure anyone you're going to be able to answer straight off the bat. But what happened to the historic townscape record from MOLA 10 2018, and is that now available? I'm not sure. Magnus, do you know if that? It's hard to pull a publication like that.
David may be best placed to answer that, if that's a MOLA produced report in relation to the site.
No, yeah, we definitely did produce a townscape assessment. Yeah, probably about 3 years ago. I'm not sure if it's in the public domain yet, but it certainly will be at some point. Helen would probably be better placed to say if it is in the public domain.
I would have thought it would be, but what we can do is obviously, if people have got specific requests for reports, if we can just ping them over afterwards. They're none of them are confidential. They're all there for people to access. So yeah, just let us know which reports you're looking for, and we'll ping them over. The story map does have some of the reports on there that people can access, but I appreciate not all of them are on there probably.
Okay, and I think there is one. Do we have time? I think we have time for one more question, and that one is about the Victorian buildings. Are they going to be remaining on the site, or are they going to be going as part of this development, or is that something that is not known?
As far as I know, so there's a couple of buildings which are being retained. I think most of the buildings which aren't being retained to be honest, I'm not sure, but there's a couple of very attractive Victorian buildings which are next to block D, which probably doesn't mean very much to the audience, but are basically off the high street to the east of the site, which are being retained, and a couple of buildings which are not within the red line, which are obviously being retained because they're not part of the development site. So it's difficult to answer that without knowing which specific buildings they're interested in, but we, as well as the Townscape report, we've also got various historic building reports which we can ping over to anyone that's interested in the historic building side of things.
Okay, I'm afraid it just says Victorian Buildings, so I can't be more specific on that one. Okay, so we are coming up to the end of this session. I apologize if we didn't manage to get around to your question. I wish I could read quicker, but I can't. But do remember there is another webinar. There's more community engagement coming. So we will send out an email tomorrow, which will have the additional resources like the story maps and links to that information there. There is going to be two, sorry, I think the camera's flickering. There we go. There is two questions at the end of this webinar, which would be really useful if you could fill it out to see how we can do better with this webinar. And then we will send out evaluation forms in that email tomorrow. If our big thank you to our panelists, and if they would like to say thank you and goodbye and turn their cameras and mics off, I will say the last farewells, and I will hope to see all of you back in attendance for the next webinar.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, folks, so thank you so much for attending. I can see there's a lot of you around there. And again, I apologize for a few of the technical hitches, but when you do this kind of webinar stuff live, it does happen. Okay, there'll be two evaluation questions at the end when this webinar finishes, and then we will send on further resources and information. For the next webinar, I'm sorry if we were unable to get to the questions, but just make sure you attend that next webinar and get them in again, and there will be a similar Q&A where you'll be able to pose those questions, and that one will be about the churchyard. Okay, thank you and goodbye.